"I never loved you," she said. Not angrily, not even defensively, just flat, like she was stating a fact she'd practiced until it stopped shaking. The room went quiet in that way that makes you aware of your own breathing. I felt something tighten in my chest, not from the words themselves, but from how carefully she avoided my eyes when she said them. I let the silence stretch, long enough to notice her fingers curling into her sleeve, long enough to hear the clock on the wall click forward. Then I asked it. Calm. Too calm. "Then why did you stay?" She looked up at me then, startled, not by the question, but by how ready I was to hear the answer. Her mouth opened, closed. Something shifted behind her expression, like a door she hadn't planned on opening. I took a step closer, slow, controlled, not threatening, certain. "Why did you come back?" I continued. "Why did you say my name like it mattered when no one else was around?" Her confidence cracked just enough to show what was underneath. And in that moment, before she spoke again, I understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever truth she was about to tell me was going to change which one of us walked away intact. Before that night, I believed I understood our story. We'd met the way many adult relationships begin, not with urgency, but with alignment, similar schedules, similar humor, a shared understanding of how to move through the world without making too much noise. We weren't reckless. We were intentional. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. She moved into my life gradually. Weekends first, then drawers, then habits. The quiet intimacy of routine settled in before I realized I'd stopped imagining an exit. She learned my rhythms. I learned the precise tone of her silences. We didn't fight often. When we did, it was contained, almost polite. That felt like maturity. I mistook that for love. She was affectionate in ways that didn't draw attention. A hand on my back when we crossed the street. The way she'd remember details I hadn't thought mattered. She showed up, she stayed, she chose consistency over drama, and I respected that deeply. What I didn't notice, what I couldn't afford to notice, was what she withheld. There were parts of her life she described without texture, stories without emotion, memories she summarized instead of reliving. When I asked about her past, she answered honestly, but briefly, as if depth was unnecessary. I told myself that was her nature. Private. Self-contained. I was wrong. The first cracks appeared in small ways. She hesitated when I spoke about the future. Not arguing, just delaying. "We'll see," became her default. When friends referred to us as permanent, she smiled without correcting them, but she never confirmed it either. I noticed, then dismissed it. Wanting something can make you generous with interpretation. I loved her steadily, without spectacle. I built my days around her presence. I began measuring time in terms of us. That kind of love assumes reciprocity even when it isn't spoken. Looking back, there were signs. The way she pulled away when I needed reassurance. How she avoided conversations that asked her to define what we were becoming. The distance that appeared whenever emotion demanded commitment instead of comfort. But she stayed. That was the evidence I trusted. Until the night she said she never loved me. And every moment I'd used as proof suddenly demanded re-examination. Because staying, I would learn, isn't the same as choosing. And consistency can sometimes be a form of avoidance. By the time we reached that conversation, I was already invested in a version of our relationship that only one of us had been living inside. What I didn't know yet was why, and whether the truth would hurt more than the lie I'd been holding on to so carefully. The confrontation didn't begin as one. We were supposed to be talking logistics, mundane things that couples discuss when something feels slightly off, but not yet broken. Schedules, a decision that needed alignment. Nothing emotional on the surface. She sat across from me, composed, almost relieved to keep things practical. That's when I said it. Not as an accusation, as a reach. I need to know where you stand. The sentence landed heavier than I expected. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she adjusted her posture, crossing her legs, buying herself a few seconds. I watched her do it and felt the first flicker of unease. "About what?" she asked. "About us," I said. "About what this is becoming." That's when her expression changed. Not defensive, not angry, resolved, like someone deciding to stop carrying something they were tired of holding. "I never loved you," she said. Flat, measured, practiced. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. Not because the words were unclear, but because they didn't match the evidence of my life. The years, the shared routines, the intimacy that had felt earned. I waited for clarification, a qualifier, a softer version. None came. I felt something inside me settle, not break, but sharpen. Pain can do that when it's unexpected. "Then why did you stay?" I asked. She inhaled slowly, as if preparing for turbulence. "Because it was easy," she said. "Because you were safe. Because you wanted me in a way I didn't have to earn." The honesty stung more than cruelty would have. "So I was convenient," I said. She flinched. That was new. "No," she corrected. "You were kind. You were stable. You gave me space to breathe." "And love?" I asked. She shook her head. "I gave you what I had." That was the incident. Not the confession itself, but the realization that the relationship I'd been living in wasn't mutual. It was asymmetrical. I'd been investing in a future while she'd been inhabiting a present that asked nothing of her emotionally. I stood up, not abruptly. I needed the distance. "So, every time you came back," I said slowly, "every time you reached for me when things got hard—" "I needed somewhere to land," she interrupted. "I didn't think it would matter if I stayed honest about what I couldn't give." I laughed once, quietly, without humor. "You let me believe," I said. "That's not honesty." Silence followed, thick, unavoidable. She didn't deny it, and in that silence I understood something irreversible. The woman I loved hadn't deceived me out of malice, but out of need. And that made what came next far more complicated. Because now the question wasn't whether she had loved me. It was whether I could forgive being chosen for everything except the one thing that mattered most. After that, the conversation stopped being theoretical. Once the truth was out, it demanded space to expand. The room felt smaller, like it was pressing in on us, forcing details to surface that had been easier to ignore when the lie was intact. I paced slowly, not to intimidate her, but because standing still felt dishonest. "You knew I loved you," I said, not accusing, stating fact. She nodded. "Yes." "And you stayed anyway?" "Yes." That admission changed the temperature between us. Before, I'd been hurt. Now, I was angry in a quieter, more dangerous way, the kind that asks for coherence. I started pulling moments from memory and laying them out one by one. Trips we took, nights she cried in my arms, the way she said my name when she was tired or afraid. "What was that?" I asked. "Performance?" Her eyes flashed. "No, it was real to me, just not love." The distinction landed like an insult disguised as nuance. "So you let me build something you knew you'd never live inside," I said. She stood up then, defensive for the first time. "I didn't plan to stay this long," she said. Things just continued. That word, continued, hit harder than ended would have. I realized how differently we had experienced the same timeline. For me, time had been cumulative, building toward commitment. For her, it had been something to occupy, to delay harder questions, to soften loneliness. The escalation wasn't loud. It was forensic. Every answer she gave clarified something I wished I hadn't understood. She'd avoided other relationships because they demanded emotional risk. She'd stayed with me because I didn't. My stability had been the shelter she rested in, not the bond she tied herself to. And when I talked about the future, I asked. She hesitated. That pause told me everything. I hoped it wouldn't come up so clearly, she said. That was when the pain shifted into something colder. Not heartbreak. Recognition. I saw myself through her eyes then, not as a partner, but as a solution. A refuge. A place she stayed while waiting for something she never named. I stopped pacing, looked at her fully. So, you didn't lie, I said slowly. You just never corrected me. She didn't respond. The escalation wasn't about discovering new betrayal. It was about understanding the scale of it. The fact that the intimacy I treasured had been built on an imbalance she'd always been aware of. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether I still loved her. It was whether love, unreturned but carefully maintained, was something I could survive without losing myself in the process. Because now that the truth had expanded to fill the room, there was no version of this where we simply adjusted and went on. Something had to end. The only surprise left was what? The moment it finally broke wasn't loud. It was precise. I stopped asking questions. That's how she knew something had shifted. I sat back down, slow, deliberate, and looked at her the way you look at someone you're seeing clearly for the first time. Did you ever think, I said, that what you were doing was cruel? Her mouth opened, then closed. She hadn't prepared for that version of the question. I never wanted to hurt you, she said. I know, I replied. That's not what I asked. Silence stretched. The clock kept working. The world didn't pause for either of us. I told myself you were strong, she said finally, that you'd be okay, that love didn't always have to be equal to be real. That was it. I felt the last of the confusion drain out of me, replaced by something solid, not rage, not sorrow, clarity. So you decided for me, I said quietly. You decided what I could survive. She looked down then. That was the first time I saw something like shame cross her face. I loved how you loved me, she whispered. The sentence landed harder than I never loved you ever could have. I stood up again, but this time there was no pacing, no agitation, just intention. That's not the same thing, I said, and you know it. She nodded, once, small. I think I always did. I walked to the door and opened it. The gesture was calm, almost gentle. That frightened her more than anger would have. You don't get to stay anymore, I said. Not as punishment, as fact. Not because you didn't love me, but because you let me believe you did. She took a step toward me, then stopped herself. She understood. This wasn't a moment for negotiation. I never meant to steal years from you, she said. I met her eyes one last time. You didn't steal them, I replied. I gave them, thinking we were building the same thing. I stepped aside. She passed me without touching, her shoulder tense, her breath shallow. At the door, she hesitated, as if waiting for something. Anger, forgiveness, collapse. None came. When the door closed behind her, the sound was soft, final. And in that silence, I felt it. not triumph, not relief, but the unmistakable end of a version of myself who had mistaken endurance for love. The truth hadn't destroyed me, but it had decided who was allowed to stay. After she left, the apartment felt unfamiliar. Not empty, exposed. I sat where I was for a long time, not replaying the argument, but reordering memories. The mind does that when a story collapses. It goes back, looking for consistency, for moments it misfiled. I saw things clearly now, not with bitterness, with accuracy. The love had been real, mine. That mattered more than I expected. What surprised me was the absence of panic. I thought I would feel foolish, diminished, embarrassed by the years I'd invested. Instead, I felt something steadier take hold. Dignity. The quiet kind that comes from finally aligning with the truth, instead of negotiating around it. In the days that followed, I didn't reach out. Neither did she. The ending didn't need commentary. We'd said the essential things. Anything after would have been about easing discomfort, not repairing damage. Friends asked what happened. I didn't explain. I said it ended. That was enough. Some stories lose their power when they're translated. I started noticing how light felt different without her, how silence sounded cleaner, how I wasn't bracing myself for emotional imbalance anymore. I hadn't realized how much energy that had taken. There were moments of grief, of course, not for her exactly, but for the future I'd constructed alone. I let that grief exist, without romanticizing it, without assigning it, meaning it didn't deserve. What stayed with me wasn't resentment. It was a lesson I hadn't known I needed. Being chosen for your stability is not the same as being chosen for your heart, and the two should never be confused. I don't regret loving her. I regret ignoring the quiet evidence that love wasn't being returned, because wanting something to be true doesn't make it so. When I think back to the moment she said she never loved me, I no longer hear cruelty in it. I hear honesty that came late, but arrived in time. I didn't walk away broken. I walked away clearer, and that clarity has stayed with me longer than the relationship ever did. That, I've learned, is what surviving love sometimes looks like.